an interest in what I hope will be an informative and stimulating series of lectures and discussions. Um, I've called this course A Brief History of Money, Banking, and Credit. It's not all that brief, but it's briefer than what perhaps it could be and what is justified by the depth of the subject. Basically, what we're going to get from me is 6 individual lectures. I'm hoping that we get through all 6 of them in the 6 weeks that we've allocated for this course. The early lecture, the first lecture, is really an early history of money. We'll then do a whole lecture on the development of banking and credit in the United States, look at the global history. And in the fifth lecture will be devoted to Henry George's views on money and banking and credit, coming from his various works. And unless we run out of time, the final lecture will be on cryptocurrency, which is something that many people have an interest in today. Some of you maybe are investing in it. Hopefully, you're going to do well with that investment. I'm not so sure that I'm ready to take that dive. But I'd like this to be as interactive as you want it to be. So feel free to interrupt me as I go through the lecture, ask questions or make comments. Ibrahima will monitor, and I'll try to monitor anyone who uses the function to raise your hand. So it'll be difficult to identify you physically, but use the function on the taskbar for Zoom that allows you to raise your hand, and then we'll try to get you in. But just so you know, maybe this is a good idea to give you just a minute of my background. I've been teaching at the Henry George School, mostly in Philadelphia, but I've taught in New York as well, going back to 1980. And my background is in finance. I came to the study of political economy from the banking sector. And so money and banking and credit has always been an important part of my own research and writing work, and how Henry George in his writings analyzed the same role of money and banking in our society has always been interesting to me and influential in my own thinking. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground over the next 6 weeks, and we'll go from the very, very beginning. The way I'd start off is by saying that the arguments over what constitutes a just system of money, banking, credit have been ongoing for, well, several thousand years. There have been always people who have been critics of the system that was in place at any given time. And there have been many, many proposals for reforming the existing system in any country. So we'll examine some of this history of how money came into use, how its use and abuse contributed to the growth and collapse of societies throughout the ancient and even the modern eras. Money is extremely important, and it has a role to play in the cycles of boom and bust that almost every economy has experienced going back thousands of years. Well, what has constituted money? Just about anything, from cattle, beads, salt, barley, whiskey, tobacco, all have served as a medium of exchange. These forms of commodity money circulated based on the fact that they were widely accepted. They had certain scarcity attached to them, and there might even be a high amount of labor required to produce the commodity. Some of you might remember the use of beads by the indigenous people of North America, and it took a lot of labor to create those beads out of stone. So those are all the reasons why commodities have come to be used as mediums of exchange. Well, the touchstone is something that came into use about 2600 BC first in the Indus Valley, and it made it possible to test soft metals for their purity. This allowed anyone who was using metals to quickly determine the content of a particular metal in a coin or even in raw metal. So from this point on, once the touchstone was in common use, it made it possible for gold and silver to become the dominant forms of coinage, of use for coinage. And although gold and silver were relatively scarce, their use as money, as medium of exchange, spread around the entire globe as the standard forms of money. An important characteristic of gold and silver, of course, is that they're nearly indestructible. They can sit at the bottom of the seas for centuries without deteriorating, and that's why so many people are still hunting for the lost ships from the Spanish and Portuguese trade with the Americas. There's still a great deal of gold and silver sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to be found. Well, early coins had a real problem. They were subject to counterfeiting. The term that is used for this is debasement, D-E-B-A-S-E-M-E-N-T. So the idea came to stamp the coins with images, usually of emperors or some leader in the community. And this made counterfeiting more difficult, but the coins could still be shaved. Just take a little bit off the edge and produce a small amount of raw metal. But if you do that with 10 or 20 coins, all of a sudden you have enough raw metal to form a new coin. And you can mint a new counterfeit coin and add to your own monetary wealth, as long as people don't catch on. But those who were engaged in trade using these coins, they would test them, they would weigh them, and so eventually, the counterfeiters would get caught. Well, this led to the need for new innovation, and the big innovation with coinage came with this: the use of ridges on the edge of the coins. So this made it impossible, or nearly impossible, for the coins to be shaved any longer. Coins with ridged edges then would be able to circulate without any concern or real concern that the coins had in some way been tampered with or lost their value. So it's interesting and probably worth noting that shaving of coins was practiced not only by private citizens, but also by kings and princes. So it wasn't just a private form of fraud, but those who were in positions of governance were also guilty of practicing these methods of creating new money out of nothing. Well, the Greeks in Asia Minor, they pioneered the use of coinage around the 7th century BC. The Roman Republic began minting coinage around 300 BC. As the Roman Empire grew, they established mints throughout the empire, and new coins were minted whenever a new emperor assumed power. So it was in part a prestigious thing to have your image on the coinage of your society. And one historian of money has also noted that in the Roman Empire, from time to time, they used wooden coins. Now, wooden coins had no intrinsic value, really, but because they had the stamp of the emperor and they were legal tender, meaning that they were acceptable for paying your taxes, acceptable in exchange, that even the wooden coins, although they were certainly not durable, they could be easily destroyed. They circulated whenever metal coins were in short supply. Well, over the course of its long existence, the Roman Empire minted coinage that's composed of several different metals. Here's a I'm a rough map of the Roman Empire at its broadest expansion. And so they're engaging in commerce all throughout the Mediterranean and all the way up to the British Isles. And so with gold and silver coinage in scarce supply, other metals had to be used as well in order to create coinage. And again, it's the Roman power that establishes these coins as legal tender. And they're used for paying taxes. They're used to pay ground rents for land that's leased from landowners by tenant farmers. The coins are used for the purchase of goods, pay taxes, and also for tribute. So early on, we have a system of global currency based on gold and silver coinage. And later on in the course, we'll discuss the war between gold and silver, what was called bimetallism in the United States and around the end of the 1800s, a major conflict over whether gold or silver was going to be the standard coinage. Well, in other ancient civilizations, the first appearance of banking activities occurred in the temples. Makes sense. The temples are where people came to make contributions to the religious, leaders. Wealthy Romans deposited their gold and silver coinage in the temples for safekeeping. They apparently thought they could trust the leaders of their religions. Well, the Temple of Saturn in this picture in Rome contained Rome's public treasury. And Roman banking was extremely important to the global economy at the time. Roman citizens could borrow money from the temples at interest. Merchant counting houses also engaged in money changing of foreign coinage for Roman currency, as well as lending activity. So there were exchange rates between coinage, depending upon the metal content. So you take your money to a merchant. They have a touchstone. They check the metallic content of the coinage that you're using, and they decide, what the ratio would be between a currency that's coming from somewhere outside the Roman Empire against the Roman currency that was in circulation. Bills of exchange were also in common use. This is I think this is a tablet of some banking activity. At least that's how I interpreted it when I found it on the internet. And it looks like they're doing accounting, some sort of accounting activity here. And so there were bills of exchange in common use by the Greeks and expanded to Rome. And this became the dominant economic power throughout the Mediterranean for economic reasons, because it enabled bank balances of merchants doing business with one another to be transferred on the bank records without the actual physical movement of the coinage. So if Roman merchants doing business with someone in Constantinople and they know each other, then they're going to have an accounting record. And so the money that is owned by the merchant may stay in Rome, and the records may show that part of the money held in Rome, owned by that merchant, now belongs to a merchant in Constantinople or some other part of the Mediterranean economy. Any questions so far? Okay. Well, as different forms of money served as effective mediums of exchange, such exchanges often involve the extension of credit by one party providing a good or service to another party. Just as today, credit meant that payment in money, goods, or services was not immediate. Thus, credit is something generally that one extends to another person, another entity for some period of time, and under terms generally understood or negotiated. So we all use credit extensively now. If you use a credit card, there's a delay in payment. If you use a debit card, it's immediate. but every business will offer their customers the opportunity for some sort of discount if they pay in advance. If some of you who are business people, you might add to this, but generally you get a statement, and it says if you pay within 30 days, you get a 5% discount. And then within some period of time, a face value, and then there's a penalty imposed if you fail to pay, in the stated amount of time. So that's something about credit is someone has to extend credit to you. We cannot self-create credit. Only government can do that. Someone has to trust us enough to extend credit to us. And that's the important distinction between individuals, private entities, and government. Well, the Roman Empire eventually fell for many reasons that we could discuss, but none of it had to do with its money system. But eventually the Roman Empire did fall. And in its place throughout much of Europe, society started to go inward, and we see the expansion of feudal manors all throughout the European continent. Smaller communities, less external trade. The lords of the feudal manors didn't rely on money income so much. There wasn't that much to go around, and so they took a share of the crops that peasants produced, and those were used as payment of rents and taxes. And the peasants generally engaged in barter, but they had little surplus to trade. So there wasn't a need for a great deal of money during the period of time that we usually call the Dark Ages. There is still trade that's going on. Not everyone is staying close to home, but it's a much more dangerous world without the Roman Empire as the society that's keeping law and order. And it starts to open up what we think of, as the Renaissance period starts to result in expansion of trade again and commerce. And it really is triggered by, I'm arguing this, the Crusades. It's the Crusades that gets people moving again. And the Fourth Crusade in 1204 was really a pivotal period in this period. The Christian armies of Europe, they sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, and they returned home with huge quantities of precious stones, gold and silver, estimated at 1 million silver marks. I don't have an inflation adjusted value of that, but a huge amount of precious metals and stones came out of Constantinople, which had stored this wealth from the time that the Western Roman Empire fell and it was moved east. So with the sacking of Constantinople, there's a great deal of money that comes into the hands of European princes and the knights as they return home. And they also were establishing large estates in the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have the increase in trade that's occurring across the Mediterranean, luxury goods coming from the Near East, coming into Europe, changing the consumption patterns, and also stimulating the change in how European communities were going to be organized. The gold and silver they brought with them set the stage for the replacement of feudal arrangements with cash and credit-driven markets. Feudalism was a system based on reciprocity. The peasants were tied to the land, they worked the land, they produced the crops. The feudal lords administered the community, and also they took in storage the surplus production from the peasants. And the idea there was if there was a drought or any kind of serious hardship, that the feudal lord would have this storehouse of surplus wealth that could help tide things over until the whatever problems went away. But with this arrival of new metallic wealth and with precious stones and luxury goods coming in, the feudal lords decided that they needed cash. The merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean wanted to be paid in cash. They didn't want to be paid in goods. So things had to change, and they did. Peasants were now increasingly required to sell their crops for cash. It's just an image of a market that arose during the late feudal period. And so the peasants took on the risks. They had to raise the cash in the markets, selling their crops, their goods, in order to get the cash to pay their ground rents to the feudal lords and also to whatever taxes they were obligated to pay. So the feudal reciprocity system broke down. The peasants assumed the risks of a failed crop or insufficient prices for what they sold, and the European economies started to develop into a market system. And a market system needed a banking sector. It needed individuals who would be able to serve the needs of the merchants operating in this, much larger arena. As I said, many of the European princes now had large landed estates in the Eastern Mediterranean. And trade was renewed. The flow of money also then created an increased need for merchant bankers. So, blessed by their locations, Venice and Genoa became the major centers of Mediterranean commerce. Florence emerged as the center of banking. And that's really the origins of the Renaissance. Now it's not only goods that are being exchanged, but knowledge is being exchanged. A lot of the ancient knowledge from Greece and Rome is finding its way back into European universities. And the world is really changing quickly from that perspective. A number of families arose as the primary merchant bankers. In Florence, there were two families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi families, that dominated Florence in the 14th century, and they established branches in other parts of Europe to facilitate the trade. And both of these banking families got into real trouble. They extended substantial loans to Edward III of England, who was engaged in the 100 Years' War against France. What do we know about financing wars? Who generally pays for the costs of war? Anybody have a comment on that?
Usually the taxpayer.
Not all taxpayers, though. This is why.
The loser?
Well, loser is eventually going to pay in many ways, but you have a monarch like Edward III, and if he raises taxes on the wealthy, they're not going to be too happy about it. But if he borrows and pays interest on the debt, he may get people to loan him the money to fight the war. The peasants, the poor people, don't have anything really to pay, any more taxes on as a result. So if he doesn't raise it through the other wealthy individuals in England or this is the general comment for any one of these monarchs who are engaging in these kinds of wars, he has to borrow. And Edward III of England did so heavily to fight against France, and the French did likewise. But as frequently occurred, Edward defaulted and the banks failed. And this is the problem that bankers had in this period. Can you really say no when the prince says, I need you to loan me, X amount of money to fight the war? And most of the bankers hedged their bets by trying to lend to both sides, because as someone mentioned, the loser is not going to be able to pay off the loans. Hopefully the winner will. And so the bankers, played as much as they could get away with it. They would lend to both sides and hopefully get repaid by at least the victors. About 1429, this character, Jacques Coeur, formed a commercial partnership with two brothers named Goddard. In 1432, he was doing business in Damascus, purchasing goods for shipment back to France. So you can see, the Mediterranean is an international center of commerce, and different individuals are starting to play prominent roles, and Coeur was one of them. His story is kind of interesting. 4 years later, he was appointed the master of the Paris Mint. The mint had been in operation since 864 AD. And because he's such a successful businessman, he gets appointed master of the Paris Mint and to other high offices. By 1450, he was, by many estimates, the wealthiest of all Frenchmen. And this is his estate in Paris. However, unfortunately for him, a year after it's completed, he's accused of poisoning an aristocratic woman. He's arrested. His property is confiscated by the king. And I guess he had generated some jealousy among powerful court attendants. And so they went after him, and he barely escaped and made his way to Rome. After that, the record on him falls silent, at least as far as I could find. Maybe if anyone else has anything you can add to his story, it would be great to hear it. So you can see that the families and individuals are playing major roles in the banking sector in Renaissance Europe. Next, the next family to emerge is the Medici. And their claim to wealth and fame is that they are the bankers to the Catholic Church in the early 15th century. So they're collecting tithes from church members, and they are investing it on behalf of the Catholic Church, of course, taking a piece of the action for themselves. They survived because they did their best to refrain from making loans to princes and kings, who were known to be poor risks. And so they remained pretty profitable until they finally gave in, and they made some loans to another English king, Edward IV. And Edward IV emptied the British treasury, fighting the War of the Roses. And so the Medici lost a lot of their wealth as a result of that. Now, what assets were left over were taken over by another family, the Fugger, F-U-G-G-E-R. Jacob Fugger was a merchant, and he married the daughter of a goldsmith. So marrying well was then and still is a way to solidify your family wealth. By 1461, he's one of the richest men in the country. His son, Ulrich, then fostered a strong relationship with the Habsburgs, and a family member in Rome also took over handling remittances to the papal court. They actually leased the mint in Rome, for about 10 years in the early 1500s. So there's another family that rises up to the occasion. They made their first loan to a Habsburg Archduke in 1487, but they were wise enough to take security from the Archduke. So they got an interest in silver and copper mines from him in return for the loan. Then in 1491, and again in 1505, they made loans to Maximilian, another Habsburg. And they secured that loan with feudal rights to 2 Austrian counties. So unless the Habsburgs were going to be totally defeated, they were going to come out smelling pretty well, even if the Habsburgs didn't have the cash to pay them back right away. In 1519, the Fuggers financed the campaign of Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, in order to help him get elected emperor. So I don't know if this is the first campaign financing that was done by the banking industry or not, but it certainly helped their position within the Habsburg empire. By the end of the 16th century, however, the family decided that they did not want to take any more risks, so they withdrew from banking and they settled into an aristocratic existence. They eventually came to control much of the European economy by the early 16th century. And by that time, their interests included silver and copper mines, trade in spices, wool and silk, and almost any other aspect of the European economy. Well, this takes us to the next real development. Donna, did you have a hand up to ask a question? I thought I saw it. No. Okay. Well, let me stop. Anyone have a comment or question so far? You've been very quiet as I've gone through this story. Any surprises to you so far? Okay. Well, so the next great step is the age of exploration and discovery. And this brought about, of course, undreamed of expansion of commerce and trade. And the inflow to Europe of precious metals taken from peoples of Central and South America, trade with Asia. It is just a dramatic expansion in global commerce. And so the role of bankers and merchant bankers becomes extremely important as the age of discovery takes place. These voyages all have to be financed. The adventurers have to raise the cash, and they're going to try to raise it from different governments, and they're going to try to, and if they can't get it from governments, they're going to try to organize some sort of stock companies and investors, and the bankers are going to participate in all of that activity to some extent. Well, because of its strategic location and its liberal economic policies, where do you think the center of banking is shifted to? Anybody have an idea? Well, it's Netherlands.
Holland, yeah.
Yeah. The Netherlands, it became in the 16th century Europe's great financial center. So coinage and bullion from all around the globe is coming through the hands of Amsterdam merchants. And the Dutch were at this time the world's most efficient shipbuilders. They had a huge merchant fleet. And this enabled them for a time to dominate world commerce. The need for a strong banking sector brought about what I would argue is probably the most important innovation that occurred up until really modern times. And that was the first banking institution that you could say was a modern bank. And this is a painting of its headquarters in the Netherlands. and it is the Bank of Amsterdam. Now, what was really unique about the Bank of Amsterdam, it was founded as a deposit bank. And its charter and was protected by the city of Amsterdam. So the city itself was the guarantor for the bank and its activities and its relations with customers. The bank took in both foreign and local coinage, which they reminted. They also took in gold and silver bullion. And so after taking a small minting and management fee, depositors were credited for the balance. So as a bank of deposit, they were not a lending institution. They basically took in money and held it on behalf of their customers, their depositors. They made their profit by providing those kinds of services. So the bank really replicated the system created by the first goldsmiths, who had strong safes constructed to protect the coined precious metals of their customers. Only now you had this institution that was doing the same thing at a much larger scale. One historian who covers this period pretty well that I would recommend to you, his name is Emanuel Wallerstein. And he's written a couple different books covering the feudal, all the way from the feudal system to the early modern economy. And he describes the importance of the Bank of Amsterdam this way. He says, it quickly became the great center of European deposit and exchange because it provided a security and convenience rare in the annals of 17th century banking. Over the century, deposits rose from under 1 million to over 16 million florins, and it became the place of retreat for owners of capital who feared for the safety of their wealth. Once enough bullion and coin was deposited, Amsterdam held the key, so to speak, to Europe's international payment system. So, all the coinage that was in circulation eventually made its way to the bank, and they would determine its exchange rate against the coinage that they were issuing, which had a standard weight and a standard metallic content. And so when they would get Spanish pieces of 8 or other current coinage coming in, they would melt that down and turn it into a standard coinage, and then give a receipt to their customers. And the receipts became the money, the paper money that became used between merchants, because it's a heck of a lot easier to carry around a wallet full of paper money than a bag full of gold coins. Well, one of the people who early on realized exactly what value the Bank of Amsterdam had to the European economy was no less than Adam Smith. In the book he wrote, The Wealth of Nations, he had analyzed the chaotic conditions that existed before the bank was established. And then he said this about the effect of the bank on the European and global economy. He writes, before 1609, the great quantity of clipped and worn foreign coin, which the extensive trade of Amsterdam brought from all parts of Europe, reduced the value of its currency about 9% below that of good money fresh from the mint. Such money no sooner appeared than it was melted down or carried away, as it always is in such circumstances. One of the things that he doesn't mention this later on. I think it was a New Zealand economist named Gresham, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure he was from New Zealand. He came up with what became known as Gresham's Law. And basically Gresham said, bad money will chase out good. Meaning that if you can get someone to accept money that's devalued, at face value, then why would you ever bring out your good money to pay for something? And you think about that throughout history, and it's certainly true that in times of war, people who had precious metal coinage, whatever, if they could get away with it, they would certainly pay for everything in paper money that was devaluing through inflation, and hold off and hold their money until time stabilized. So Gresham's law was in effect even at that point in time. People just made common sense that if you can get someone to accept something that's not quite as valuable for what you're buying, then you're basically getting a nice discount. Adam Smith goes on to say about the Bank of Amsterdam, the merchants with plenty of currency could not always find a sufficient quantity of good money to pay their bills of exchange. And the value of those bills, in spite of several regulations which were made to prevent it, became in great measure uncertain. And so this is what had to be dealt with. So as Adam Smith explained, once the Bank of Amsterdam began doing business, the impact on international commerce was game-changing. And I wish more modern economists would spend some time looking at the history of the Bank of Amsterdam and pay more attention to how it operated in terms of contributing to the global stability of money exchanging at the time. So Smith goes on to add this. He says, the bank received both foreign coin and the light and worn coin of the country at its real intrinsic value in the good standard money of the country, deducting only so much as was necessary for defraying the expense of coinage and other necessary expense of management. And he goes on to say, for the value which remained after this small deduction was made, it gave a credit in its books. This credit was called bank money, which, as it represented money exactly according to the standard of the mint, was always of the same real value and intrinsically worth more than current money. So you can see how that would stabilize prices. You have one international monetary unit that was constant. Every coin had the same weight. Every coin had the same metallic content. And people began to, just rely on the fact that when they needed to cash in their receipt money, they would get a high value coinage that they could rely on. Well, the story would have been great. It would have been a story that maybe would have made its way to modern times. But like all good things, they can go awry. And so by the mid-1600s, the committee of city government officials who administered the bank's operations began to do some things that they shouldn't do. They allowed depositors to overdraw their accounts. Later still, the bank extended large loans to the Dutch East India Company, as well as to the municipality of Amsterdam. Loans that exceeded the bank's own assets, and then the total money held on behalf of its depositors. So early on, the bank has profits, right? It has in its vaults its money that it has earned by providing services. And so it could loan that money out. It could, give a note to say that, okay, we're going to make this loan at interest to the city of Amsterdam or the Dutch East India Company. But they didn't stick to that. They succumbed to the temptation to issue far more banknotes than they had actual money on deposit to back those notes. So sadly, in my view, the era of full deposit banking came to an end. And looking at history from that point on, I just say, what could possibly go wrong? We had sound money up until that point of time with the Bank of Amsterdam. The quantity of paper money in circulation equaled exactly what they had in their vaults, but they came to understand, just as the merchant bankers had understood, not everyone is going to come for their money at the same time. So they felt safe in issuing more banknotes than they had money to redeem if people would come and want their money. And eventually, word gets around. It seems like there's more money in circulation. And so all of a sudden, you start to get inflation. Prices start to go up. The confidence in the system started to diminish. And unfortunately, for the bank itself, they felt compelled, we have to do something to raise money quick. And so they started to engage in a lot of different speculations. And the one that killed them was speculations in the tulip bulb market. And for a long time, the price of tulip bulbs was going up and up and up. I don't understand that market. I don't know why. But they were scarce and rare, and people wanted them, and they were willing to pay more and more for them. But when that asset bubble crashed, which is consistent with all assets, whether it's tulip bubbles, stocks, gold, silver, land, eventually, when prices get to be too high, there's a correction. And so the tulip bubble occurred, the market crashed, and the bank lost big time. Remarkably, however, and this is worth noting, they didn't go out of business. They still had enough in assets, and they loans were gradually paid off. So even though they lost a good deal, the bank survived until 1796, when it was dissolved. Well, so the Dutch were losing their top position among the major trading powers in Europe at the time. And as the Dutch fortunes fell, the fortunes of England and France were rising, and particularly towards the British Isles. And Britain needed a central bank. It needed some sort of a banking system, and they looked at the Bank of Amsterdam as a model, but decided that they did not need to create a bank on a full deposit receipt money basis. And so in 1694, the Bank of England was chartered as a fractional reserve bank. Well, what did that mean? The founder of the bank, William Patterson, a Scot, raised 1.2 million pounds from subscribers. That money was then loaned to the crown. Okay, so the initial capital of the bank was loaned to the government. In return, the Bank of England became the government's banker and debt manager. So the revenue that the government was going to take in would go through the Bank of England. And also any bonds that the government issued would go through the bank. And so the Bank of England would obviously get some sort of fee structure every time the government issued debt, and that debt was sold in the private markets. Some amount of fee would come to the Bank of England. The government's taxing powers were what was relied on to provide the funds to the Bank of England should there be a need. What that meant was, if all of a sudden depositors came to the bank and they wanted to take out their money and the bank didn't have it, they would just knock on the exchequer or the treasurer of the British government and say, we need some funds. And so since the Bank of England was already the government's banker and was collecting its tax revenue, they would just make a bookkeeping entry, and the Bank of England was able to stabilize on that basis. So it was actually a very workable system, although in my view, it was built on a significant fraud against the public. Fractional reserves means you lend out more than you have. And how do you lend people something you don't have? Well, if you have a charter from the government that allows you to do so, it can happen. The era of fractional reserve banking became the common practice. And this is just an image of the Bank of England, and I've added a little colorful map of the world there. And so Britain takes the lead from the Netherlands as the world's financial center. It doesn't mean that the Netherlands is out of the picture, but Britain is rising as the Dutch situation is coming to an end. Their dominance is coming to an end. Well, the global economy at this point enters a long period of fractional reserve banking. There are no more full deposit banks established anywhere in the world that I've been able to find. Not in Asia, and in Africa, in the Middle East. Nowhere is a bank like the Bank of Amsterdam still in existence. By the early 18th century, however, Britain is now on a gold standard. And we have to have some discussion about what that means. You hear the term all the time. The gold standard for Britain was formalized in 1821. Other countries, including the United States, followed Britain. And the banks were required by law to hold on deposit gold coinage equal to some percentage of the banknotes printed and loaned or spent in circulation. And depending upon the country, it could be as high as 60% or as low as 20%. The central banks acted in this regard as lenders of last resort in the event a member bank couldn't meet the demands for cash by depositors. And that's, if you fast forward to the United States and the Federal Reserve System, that being lender of last resort is one of the responsibilities of the Federal Reserve System. Now, it takes a lot of management. You're going to have banknotes that are going to be in circulation that cannot be redeemed if everyone wants to come and get specie. Gold and silver coinage, the term is used to describe what they are. They're hard money or specie. And people, thought that the paper currency that they were getting was going to be backed, at least to some degree, by specie. And the system worked well enough, so long as there was no general panic, there was no great loss of confidence in the system. Wars also always create, tension. And if you happen to be in a country where you think your government, your country might lose the war, and you have a fair amount of gold and silver wealth, what do you think you might do with that? Well, think back in your own family history. All of us at some generation ago came from another country, and maybe we left the country, our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, whatever generation it might be, decided that where they were born and raised was no longer a hospitable place to be. And if they had assets and their country was being invaded, or there was some sort of political turmoil, a potential, uprising or whatever, a good thing to do would be to get your assets out of the country and into a safe harbor. And so that's one of the things that happens during times of turmoil in countries. Those with a significant amount of wealth to lose will try to find a safe harbor for that wealth. If they feel it could be taken by the government, to help pay for the war, or simply it's going to lose, it's possibly might be taken, in the event that you're the bank that houses your wealth is taken over by some foreign country, foreign army. So the system of fractional reserve banking depends on public confidence. It depends on a good deal of stability. And if there's no panics, things work fairly well. But history tells us that every so often, there will be some sort of event that is going to cause a panic to occur. And the banking system will get shaken at its core unless government makes the right decisions at the right time. Well, in the modern era, the family that rose in prominence as bankers was founded in the late 18th century by Meyer Rothschild. He was a court factor to the leading aristocratic family of Frankfurt that was then within the Holy Roman Empire. So Meyer established a finance business and eventually appointed his 5 sons to manage the family's affairs in London, Paris, Naples, Vienna, and Frankfurt. The Rothschild family has been and continues to be a prominent banking family even to today. Their business grew from trading in goods and foreign exchange, and it eventually included merchant banking, private banking, asset management, mergers and acquisitions, insurance, venture capital, pension management, sovereign debt, and the finance of commodity acquisitions. And that should sound to you like what it is, and that is the kind of multinational corporate enterprise that now exists in the major banks in the world. Here's a family image of Meyer and his 5 sons. They did a lot of remarkable investments in helping countries modernize. They invested in major infrastructure projects such as bridges, tunnels, railways, and they even provided financing for the construction of the Suez Canal. So they were risk takers. I'm sure that they did what any good banker does, and that is price for the risk. This is the one thing that many people don't understand about how banking decisions are made about loans. There are societal concerns about this as well, because those who tend to be the least able to carry debt are charged the highest. The interest rates are the highest for the poor. The fees are the highest for people who have bad credit. And from a risk standpoint, for a banker, it makes perfect sense. From the standpoint of the interests of society, of getting people who have the least, a leg up on the economic ladder, it's a burden. It's very difficult for people without existing assets to get financing for their ideas, for enterprise, for whatever activities they would like to engage in. So as we talk about the banking sector and going forward and about credit, we'll try to talk a little bit about this issue of the societal obligation of the banking institutions, if any. What obligations do they have to us as a citizenry? into the community. And different banking establishments, even today, have either a very high profile in that regard or don't participate much at all, if anything, in the kind of community development work that I mentioned. Well, Nathan Rothschild set up operations in London. And today, the firm of N.M. Rothschild and Sons has some 80 billion euros in assets under management and reported 1.87 billion pounds in revenue in 2019. So, as I say, still a major player in global finance. Although you don't hear very much about what the Rothschild firm is doing. They seem to be pretty successful in avoiding public attention. Now, competition in banking and finance also came from a family by the name of Baring, B-A-R-I-N-G, which provided credit to many corporations during the Industrial Revolution. Part of the family settled in England early in the 18th century. Johann Baring built a flourishing business as a wool exporter, and his sons established Baring's Bank in London, and the bank grew into a leading merchant bank. Of course, there were other family-founded banking dynasties that were established around the world, in Japan and China and Russia, etc. Each of those countries had some banking dynasty at some point in their histories. And a few have survived to continue in operation today. And what I've given you in this first lecture is just the major ones that had an impact on European and American economic history. So with that, I will stop and open it up to discussion. We have about 25 minutes till we can talk about anything I've covered here, or anything that I didn't cover that you wish I had covered. So, questions and comments.
Yeah, I've got one. This is Alan here.
Yes.
Great overview of history there. I would be interested to look into the logistics of lending. You mentioned these banking families in Italy, such as the Bardis and the Fuggers. You said the Medicis avoided lending to kings and princes, but lent to the Pope. And what were the logistics when one of these loans was made to a king or a prince or to the Pope? Did coins change hands initially, or was it some kind of paper contract that was made, and
This is what
the
the bills
made by the Pope, he got coins somehow, or how did that happen?
Alan, it all depended upon the level of trust. So, if the level of trust existed, then you made an accounting entry transferring a balance from the bank or the merchant to the borrower or the recipient. So
and the recipient would have an account with that merchant?
Yes.
Okay.
And so a bill of exchange, for example, would have enough detail on it that even a third party you could present. Let's say I bought something from you, and I gave you this bill of exchange. I'm intending to pay you, of course, and now it's going to be recorded in my bank and in your bank. Now you have a document that says that even though I don't physically have control of the money, I have legal control of the money. And so a third party that you want to do business with might accept that. You would transfer ownership of the money through an assignment of the bill of exchange. And because people don't want to, people did not want to load down a ship with gold coins if unnecessary. It's dangerous, and it's not a very efficient way to conduct commerce. So the money pretty much stayed in the vaults of the merchant bankers or the banks, as long as those merchant bankers and the banks were trusted. And just like every panic there's ever been, when people all of a sudden don't trust the holder of their money, they go to the door and they demand it.
Right. And so this bill of exchange, would that be transferable multiple times? How long did it stay? How long did it circulate? And at what point did somebody demand coin? I mean, I'm sure it depended, but
Yeah,
could they circulate multiple times, the bills of exchange?
yes, but you have here's the best answer I can give you is this, again, based on trust. So if you and I have done business for 20 years, we trust each other.
Mhm.
And so you can say to the next person that you've done business with 20 years who doesn't know me, hey, I've done business with Ed, and I know, that the money is in the vault, it's in the bank, and there's no worries about this being honored should you present this bill of exchange to the bank.
Mhm.
And so I can't tell you how often these bills of exchange would exchange from party to party, but the receipt money that was issued by the Bank of Amsterdam, for example, could be exchanged forever, because it was redeemable by who the holder would just be able to take it to the Bank of Amsterdam if they wanted and get their specie. No
Yeah.
questions asked.
Thank you.
Say, I'm wondering what role the banks in the 17th century England played in facilitating the slave trade, the triangular trade.
Slaves were just a good. So to the extent that money was needed to buy ships, to hire crew, the bankers would be right there based on their analysis of the risk versus reward. They had the Netherlands, for example, had not only expertise in banking, but insurance as well. And then eventually you had other entities like Lloyd's of London, in the coffee shops, all these, insurance brokers, whatever, would determine what kind of fees would be required to ensure the completion of a transaction. And that transaction could include the enslavement, people that are enslaved, captured in Africa and taken to the New World. Yeah.
So were they also involved in financing the sugar trade between England and the islands, the
Yes.
Indies?
Yeah. I mean, each one of the European countries engaged in trade under mercantilist. That term is pronounced two different ways: mercantilism or mercantilism. But the idea, it's a closed circuit of trade. In other words, the goods are taken from the colonies, raw materials, taken from the colonies back to the home country on mother country ships, turned into manufactured goods, and then those manufactured goods are shipped back on mother country ships to the colonies, and it's a closed system. And every country tried to adopt that closed system, but there's always leakage. So,
Well, did the British banks flourish in comparison to other European banks in that during that slave trade period?
the British bank. Here's Well, you know the story. People like Sir Francis Drake. How did he find? How did he get the attention of Queen Elizabeth? Well, he was a privateer. So, the English built these fast moving, powerful ships, and they did their best to capture every Spanish and Portuguese vessel that came back from the New World loaded with precious metals. And there are other aspects to this as well. Spain in particular was not very good at any kind of manufacturing. And so it wasted a lot of its wealth that it acquired in the New World on luxury goods. And because they couldn't produce necessities for themselves in sufficient quantity, they had to buy a lot of their necessaries from the countries that produced them. So a lot of the precious metals, the species that came into Spain, flowed right through Spain up into the Netherlands and to England. And so gradually it was the Dutch and the British bankers and merchants that became the most prosperous among the Europeans. The French and the Spanish, but each really remained very aristocratic in their economic systems, and so they did not allow much individuality in terms of invention and innovation. So you find that output in Spain and in France trailed the output and economic output that occurred in the Netherlands and in Britain. Did I answer your question?
Ed, I have a question, Alan Coslow here.
Yeah, I turned my mic off. Sorry, but thanks for that.
Okay, was that? If I would say, if you can get a hold of Wallerstein's book, Emmanuel Wallerstein's book, you'll get a lot more insight into the rise and fall of the various European powers in terms of their dominance over the economic situation. I mean, France was engaged in wars all the time. Its aristocratic families paid almost no taxes, and so they were the French monarchs were constantly in serious debt. Their treasury was nearly empty. In fact, the finance minister during the American Revolution, the finance minister to Louis XVI told Louis, if you help the Americans, we will go broke. Our treasury is almost empty now. The last thing that we can afford to do is fight another war with England to help the Americans. But Louis didn't listen. And what his finance minister Turgot basically warned came about, and that was the French Revolution. So kings, I don't know, ego gets over common sense many times. Maybe that's true of politicians of every era. Someone else wanted to ask a question.
Hi, Ed. It's Alan Coslow. How are you?
I'm fine, Alan.
Sorry I got here late, but I got a question going back several centuries. The Jewish banking that started basically on the Silk Road out of Jews that were in Baghdad. And there was one family that basically stretched all the way from China to Turkey and Italy. And then they actually even had family going up into the Netherlands. And then obviously the Rothschild is a product of this. The Rothschilds are a product of this. And what I understand I heard from a Israeli researcher on this who looked back at this, and they basically would give notes. And so anybody if they had money that they made in, let's say, China, and they wanted to get it to the Netherlands, they would deposit it with one of these Jewish families there. They would get a note from them, and they can basically cash in that note anywhere along there. And this was the predominant means of banking and money, and being able to travel without worrying about your money being robbed from you for almost 5 centuries, from like around the 10th century through the 14th century. How did that influence what later happened in Europe?
I think it's just a continuation, really, and again, the Eastern Mediterranean is the core. It's the center of international commerce, as you say. You know, trade coming all the way from China through the Middle East, and then branching off all the way across the European continent, north and south. So it only made sense for not just Jewish people, but the Arabs as well played a big role in the banking of that activity, providing merchant banking support for international commerce.
Yeah.
The big difference, of course, is that it was considered usurious for Christians to charge other Christians interest, but the Jewish religion did not prohibit Jewish bankers from charging interest to non-Jewish people. That's my understanding. So, I don't have all the details on that period. From what I read, though, just as smuggling occurs to get around government intervention, there are all sorts of ways where all sorts of people did their best to get around whatever religious convictions were at issue. So, I suspect there was a lot going on that was inconsistent with what the religious clerics were trying to get the people to behave.
Just another interesting fact that when the banking industry in Spain until the Inquisition was basically run by the Jews for the exact reason that you just said.
Yeah.
Prohibition. And then when the Inquisition happened, all the Jews went up to Netherlands. And it's actually very interesting because the banking industries in the Netherlands are still basically controlled by Jewish families.
Well, yeah, I mean, it takes a couple of centuries with the Inquisition for people to begin. Anyone with the entrepreneurial spirit left Spain, and they also left Belgium, which was part of Spain. So the southern Netherlands, Belgium, was Catholic, and so all the opportunity in the 1600s was in the Netherlands, which was Protestant and liberal for the time. It was cosmopolitan, I guess, is the best word to describe the Netherlands from the late 1500s, on.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else? Anyone else have any comments, questions?
There's Peter, I think, raised his hand.
Peter, you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks, Ed, for a very interesting lecture. I was going to ask, were you intending in these lectures to look at, and Alan mentioned China and the trade from China, but are you going to look at the Chinese banks?
Hold on a second, Peter. Someone else has their microphone open. I'm hearing some background noise, like someone, I don't know, making dinner or something. I don't know what it is.
I think it's Robert Cash's.
Let me take a look at that, Ed.
Okay, go ahead, Peter.
I was going to say, are you going to look at China, because Richard Werner in his book, Princess of the End, talks about China having the first paper money in the 10th century, and of course the emperor in that time in the Zhang dynasty really, in a way, established the first central bank, and that facilitated the trade across, as you described, to Europe. I'm wondering whether you're going to, in your lectures, going to address the issue of China.
Well, I have to say, I mean, my presentation, my research has been, Eurocentric. So there's a great deal of history that should be added to deal with, particularly the Chinese, dominance over the ancient world. I haven't done that research. Maybe someone here in attendance would like to take it on as a challenge. I see Robin has her hand up. Hello? We're still there?
Yeah, I just forgot to take it down. Sorry about that. You answered my questions a little while back, so I'll
Okay.
get that down and out of your way, all right?
Anyone else? Well, then we've done a great job because we've gotten through the first lecture on time with good time for Q&A and discussion. So next week I'll pick up the story from where we've left off. We're going to get into a full-fledged discussion of the impact of fractional reserve banking and take a look at the history of the rise of the banking entities and money systems that dominated the colonial North America and eventually the United States. So with that, I guess I'll thank you all for coming and say good night. And Peter, good morning.
Thanks a lot, Ed, and we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time. And just to remind you, we have another class on Wednesday with Dr. Marty Rowland on
Thank you.
growth and
Thank
anarchy.
you.
Join us if you can.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.